Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I am your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really happy to have with me once again Jeff Deist, formerly Chief of Staff for Ron Paul when Dr. Paul was running for president. And now I'm happy to say that Jeff is the president of the Mises Institute. And I'm guessing many, if not most of you, are familiar with the Mises Institute, but if not, I strongly suggest you do become familiar with it because the Institute, which is named after the great Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises, has among human institutions, in my view, the only answer to America's economic and social demise. Of course, of those in power, folks in power are not interested. They don't have much to say about the Mises Institute. Is probably one of the reasons you don't hear very much about it, because the Institute, most certainly its ideas of freedom and liberty, threaten the system of theft that the central banks have clandestinely carried out against the masses of people, really throwing fraudulent money at us, really essentially systematically destroying price discovery of capital. And how can we have capitalism if you can't know what the price of capital is? Well, that's certainly what the central banks have done. They've destroyed and are in the process of destroying capitalism. So I would strongly suggest you go to the Mises Institute website. That's Mises.org, MISES.org, where you will find many very interesting and thought-provoking articles. For example, some of them that I noticed were posted there when I took a look today at the website. Why women pay higher prices for the same products, why drafting women is a terrible idea, how government buys your support, and why negative interest rates are guaranteed to fail. Also, the Institute has many videos and interviews that Jeff does with various people and various things of not only entertaining, but I think very valuable in terms of helping us understand how the world really works. And you can even catch up with some of the events that the Mises Institute carries out. I know the Mises Circle event that I attended in New York a couple of years ago. Also, last year up in Connecticut, they just had one down in Houston, and it was an excellent interview I watched there that really sort of gives you some reason for optimism. Lou Rockwell, who was the founder of the Mises Institute, gave an excellent speech there, and you know, we talk a lot on this show about gloom and doom, but there are reasons to be hopeful. You know, if the truth gets out there, and Dr. Paul has always talked about the reasons to be hopeful is that the truth is that we have truth on our side, and I believe that's true. I believe the Mises Institute, in terms of its basic views, and are based on reality. And I think anybody who looks at their work will understand that that's the case. But in any event, I'm really pleased to have Jeff Deist, the president of the Mises Institute, with me today. Thanks for joining me, Jeff.
Well, thank you, Jay.
You know, I want to ask you and focus on the title of our show, Negative Interest Rates and a Cashless Economy. Dictatorship arrives. Well, it sounds pretty ominous. But before we get to that, tell us about the Mises Institute. How are things going there? Any upcoming events on the East Coast where I might easily go to? You know, I think you maybe mentioned something in Boston coming up this year.
Yes, Jay, we do have something in Boston in October, I believe. So our website, Mises.org, has more news about that event, trying to get some great speakers for that. We also have events this year in Dallas-Fort Worth, thinking Seattle, here in Auburn, Alabama as well. So we have a pretty busy 2016 planned, and looking forward to it very much.
Well, let's get on to this idea of negative interest rates. Japan has now gone to negative rates, and a couple of European countries as well. How likely do you think it is that the U.S. is going to go in that direction as well? Because I'm hearing different ideas from the mainstream. Some are saying, yes, we need to do it. Larry Summers, for example. And then there was another gentleman that I just saw the other day from BlackRock that was saying, oh, what a bad idea it is. So, you know, these are two people from the mainstream that seem to have different ideas. But what do you think? Do you think it's likely we're going to head into negative interest rate territory in the U.S.?
I would have to say no. Certainly not impossible, but I don't think it's likely, at least not imminently likely. Mm-hmm. You know, if you go back and recall that during the period of the late bubble and then the crash of 2008, Congress passed an emergency stabilization bill. I love this, right? It sounds like something out of an Ayn Rand novel. And one of the things that bill did was it permitted, in fact, authorized the Federal Reserve to pay Fed member banks interest on their excess reserves held at the Fed. At Ben Bernanke's urging, the effective date of that legislation was pushed up to 2008. So as of about 2008, banks have been getting interest payments of a quarter point on their excess reserves held with the Fed. So the effect of all this has been to prevent the federal funds rate from becoming negative, right? The overnight rate at which banks lend money to each other basically cannot become negative when they can just park their reserves and get a quarter point from the Fed.
I see.
So as a result of that, as long as that remains in place, it's unlikely that commercial banks would turn around and offer or demand negative interest rates from their, let's say, prime borrowers or prime depositors. So as long as that remains in place, I think it's unlikely. But there's no reason that cannot be removed legislatively. And also, the bill that was passed by Congress didn't mandate this on the Fed. It authorized and permitted it. So I think the Fed internally, through its own policies, could change this rule without Congress acting. So that's something interesting to keep your eye on if you want to have maybe a bellwether.
Well, it's interesting, Jeff, you mentioned 0.25%. I know it was 0.25%, but it's my understanding, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that when the Fed increased the interest rates recently, they actually increased that to 0.5% to the member banks. So I may be wrong about that, but that's my understanding. So it would seem as though the Fed is moving in the opposite direction of negative rates, or at least wanting us to think they are.
Well, it's a very un-American concept, isn't it? Negative interest rates. So we're not quite yet as malleable as the Japanese and European citizenry. At least I hope that's the case.
Yeah, well, we can hope, because I just can't imagine a negative interest rate. It just seems so absurd. It just doesn't make any sense at all. And the Austrians, least of all, maybe I'm just too much schooled in the Austrian economic theory. And maybe, as you say, Americans are just too logical yet about how the world really works, in spite of all of the propaganda we get day in and day out from the folks like Larry Summers and Paul Krugman and the like that think we should go to negative rates now to spur the demand side of borrowing. Interestingly enough, one of the people that I listened to recently was saying, well, Larry doesn't understand that, in fact, what he's talking about only is the demand side of borrowing. What about the lenders? And what you're doing is essentially crimping the margins that banks get when they lend money. And so going to negative interest is just not going to work, because banks won't be willing to lend. People might be willing to borrow, but banks won't be willing to lend. But in any event, talk to us a little bit, Jeff, about the Austrians have a view that I think is absolutely right about interest rates, their understanding of interest and why it's necessary to let the markets prevail, and why you have to have positive interest rates always.
Well, conceptually, it is very important to understand that interest rates represent human action. They represent time preferences amongst human actors. And more than anything, interest rates are prices. If we think of interest rates as prices, just like we think of the price of milk, then it's perhaps more conceptually clear that the government ought to leave those prices alone and not manipulate them. Basically, the price of borrowing money depends on two things. It depends on the lender's willingness to not buy stuff today, but rather to give you the money in exchange for some interest payments and a little more money down the road, but with some risk that you might default. And then the borrower's preference to say, I want to consume something, maybe that's a new car, so badly today without waiting and saving up for it, that I'm willing to pay a premium in the form of interest to have it today. So the lender prefers to give you some money today in exchange for more money down the road. The borrower prefers the opposite. And the point at which their relative time preferences of the borrower and the lender come together is what we ought to call the price or the interest rate. Unfortunately, central banks come along and interfere in this relationship, but it's so important for us to understand it conceptually first, to then understand what's wrong with what central banks are doing. So interest rates are just prices, and they represent a supply and demand and a meeting of the minds between the borrower and the lender, just like the price of anything else.
And so savings really do represent capital, doesn't it, Jeff? I mean, we have the notion here that capital can be created out of thin air. We recapitalize the banks by printing enormous amounts of money and then directing that money into the banking system, partly by that positive interest rate that was paid to the banks for just keeping their money there. But it seems to me, as you point out, that if you agree that savings is really what are true, honest, legitimate capital, it's what is not consumed savings, then the price of those savings are not allowed to be discovered, right? That's what's happening when you suppress the interest rate. You're not allowing that price of capital to be discovered. And if you can't allow the price of capital to be discovered, how can you have capitalism? Can it survive in that environment?
Well, you really don't have capitalism. You have a mixed economy. And of course, price discovery is so important because without that, we don't really know what consumer preferences are, and we don't really know what capital accumulation or savings rates would be. But you're right. Capital accumulation, which occurs when individuals or businesses bring in more money than they spend, is absolutely at the heart of a productive economy. Now, what we might call neo-Keynesianism that rules today focuses only and ever and always on consumption. The whole concept of GDP is spending. It's all consumption. And so they have this maniacal idea that we have to create constantly demand for people to buy stuff. And when in fact, demand is inherent in human nature. We all want more stuff. We all want a more comfortable life. But what's not inherent in human nature is whether or not we're productive enough to pay for it, to afford the stuff. And so what the Fed does is it distorts that and makes us feel like we're richer than we are. And unfortunately, from the Austrian perspective, when this the boom is artificial and the bust is deeper and more painful than it would be under natural cycles that might occur absent a central bank or a federal government intervening in the whole process.
Well, getting back to this negative interest rate thing, it seems to me, I mean, it's being tried now in Japan. It's being tried, I think, is it in Switzerland, maybe one of the Nordic countries or a couple of them. I don't see any reason why people wouldn't take their money out of the banks, Jeff. Why would they not take their money out of the banks if that's the case?
Well, of course they would. It would cause bank runs in a rational world. And that's the last thing that central bankers want because they fear and hate and fight deflation. So that would be a deflationary event, right? Cash would be taken out of circulation. No one in their right mind would put $1,000 in the bank today in exchange for $900, a year or two from now. In any rational world. The only reason that this is even possible is because if you have some sort of fixed rate of loss, negative interest from the bank or from a bond, let's say a coupon bond, you might say, well, it's an insurance policy, right? The world's going to hell, but at least this way I know that my nominal 1,000 will be nominal 900 when I get it back, as opposed to nominal 800 or 700. So you almost have to view negative interest rates as kind of an insurance policy against greater loss than the stated negative rate. But again, absent negative insurance rates, there's no natural rate of interest that would ever be negative. No one would ever say, I'll give you $1,000 today, and in time, you'll pay me back $900. That would never occur absent central bank and federal and government meddling.
So if, let's say, the next step then to avoid or keep people from taking money out is being proposed, it seems, at least it's being proposed in Europe. I think somebody's proposing to take the 500 euro note out of circulation, and Larry Summers, I think it was Mr. Summers, is suggesting we get rid of the $100 bills in the United States. Seems to be a step in that direction of wanting to go towards total digital money, away from cash in your pockets. I mean, do you see that as a possibility sometime down the road? I guess if you go negative interest rates, it could be a possibility. Or if people are just frightened about the solvency of the banks in which they put their money in, they might also, if they're fearing bail-ins, for example, people might want to start taking their money out of banks and putting it under the mattress, or perhaps buying gold at Gold Money or BitGold or someplace like that.
Well, there's no question about it. Larry Summers is not, in today's world, he's not considered some outside the mainstream guy. He's a former Treasury Secretary. So if they do move towards negative interest rates and towards bail-ins, there's no question that people would want to get as much cash out of the bank as they could. So they would have to simultaneously move us towards more of a cashless system. We already see the people who have sort of early forewarning in this are out there busy buying safes and putting physical cash in them. We've seen this in Japan. So I think the future will hold an intensifying war on cash, and this proposal by Summers to eliminate the $100 note and above. There used to be $1,000 and $5,000 U.S. banknotes back when those were worth a lot more, of course. If you just got rid of $100 bills and left us with 20s and below, first of all, you'd eliminate something like 60% of all cash in circulation face value. And you would just make it so much harder for people to hoard cash. So it's a very scary proposition. And, this is how government does things. It issues these trial balloons and it kind of tests public opinion, like when Summers said this the other day, and then it ratchets it back. But what seems outrageous today might not seem so outrageous a year from now or 5 years from now. So I suspect that this is coming, and I suspect that wise people will take steps now to ensure that they have some cash or physical gold or physical silver outside of the banking system altogether to protect themselves.
Well, exactly, Jeff. And I would, the one main reason that the establishment has always said you don't want to own gold is because it gives you no interest rates. You get no return on it. Well, heck, now you're getting less than any return. You're getting no return for your bank deposits. Why keep your money? Why keep the dollar? Of course, you can argue as long as gold is going down against the world's reserve currency, you're still better off owning dollars than gold, although recently, so far this year, that hasn't been the case. In almost every currency around the world, gold has appreciated last year, except the dollar and maybe one or two others. So I can't think of any reason why people shouldn't be thinking in those terms now, Jeff, before it's too late. Because as you say, they send out these trial balloons. There's a bit of a gasp on the part of logical, reasonable people. They pull it back, and then sometime in the future, when there's another something comes along that's really frightening, then they do it to us probably. I mean, I can't imagine that the whole idea of the tremendous amount of the policies that were put into place after 2008, 2009 were unbelievable. They were almost unimaginable before that. So I don't know. I think you're right. Well, in terms of looking forward here, Jeff, with about 7 or 8 minutes left yet, this time goes so fast, but looking at presidential politics now and the election politics that are going on, I mean, some people have really talked about it being more of a circus or bread and circus than anything else. But the press is asking the question, can Trump be stopped? Why should that question even be asked? I mean, aren't we supposed to be a country by the people and for the people? Why should they even be asking why, and who's behind that question? Why should Trump be stopped?
That's interesting. It makes me laugh how many $40,000 a year journalists are so slavishly beholden to people who don't care about them, but who manipulate and control public opinion. It really is a sort of, we could spend a whole day on that topic sometime. But yes, I think that he can be stopped, and I suspect that he will. You'll notice just the other day, let's say a week ago now, Salon.com had an article about how Hillary is going to lose the whole thing, and she's so vulnerable, and there's never been a successful nominee who was under serious investigation by the FBI, and she's unlikable, and she has health problems, and blah, blah, blah. So a few days later, Hillary prevails in the Nevada Democratic primary. Now, if you believe Roger Stone or some other people, she prevailed in an unholy manner, but nonetheless, she prevailed. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, just less than a week later, we're back to this narrative of Hillary's inevitability.
Yes.
So in just a week's time, there's such a need to sell clicks and eyeballs and get people to headlines that you can't trust what you read week to week. So if someone is saying, can Trump be stopped, the implicit assumption is that he somehow seems unstoppable. And that's very much a week-to-week, primary-to-primary thing. So he could absolutely be stopped in this upcoming Super Tuesday or SEC primary in the South. So there's nothing inevitable about Trump.
Yeah, well, interesting you mentioned Roger Stone, because there's an excellent interview that I know that Lou Rockwell did with him recently, and he was laying out the possibilities or the likelihood of a brokered convention in Cleveland, and noting that there was actually a law put in, a rule put in by the Republicans, I think, that was really meant to stop your former boss, Ron Paul, from making any great progress, that essentially makes it almost impossible, unless you are a dominant frontrunner and you win a certain number of not just plurality, but a majority of voters in various states. And it was, according to Stone, it was put in place by the Romney people to make sure Ron Paul didn't get any kind of traction or have any possibility of being. He wasn't even nominated. So in order to be nominated, they're making the hurdle so high that they can basically control it. And the idea that Stone has is that we'll go into Cleveland on a brokered convention, and then the power brokers behind the scene will decide who they want to be president. And he's suggesting it could even be another Bush. What are your thoughts?
Well, first, it'd be lovely, wouldn't it, if this rule that the GOP establishment put into place to hurt Ron Paul in 2012 comes back to bite them and actually favors Trump, because let's say Rubio or Cruz don't win 8 states outright, and thus none of their supporters can make a motion from the floor that they be the nominee. So I would love to see that scenario play out. But I don't think they're going to bring back Jeb. At the end of the day, I would say most establishment Republicans are perfectly comfortable with a Hillary Clinton presidency.
Yeah.
In terms, her tenor might be different, but her domestic policies are going to be largely indistinguishable from a Rubio or a Kasich. Mm-hmm. And her foreign policy is going to be the same as a Rubio or a Kasich, but perhaps more bloodthirsty, because as the first woman, she wants to prove her toughness or something, God help us. Yeah. So, we have to understand that it's not Democrats versus Republicans so much as it is sort of inside the Beltway versus outside. So they can live with Hillary, and they certainly will. And they'd much rather have Hillary than Trump.
All right. Well, Jeff, we're going to have...
So there we go.
We're going to have to leave it at that because I'm out of time. It's so much more to talk about, but I just want to tell my listeners it's Mises.org. Go there and you'll hear a lot of the interviews that Jeff does there, and a lot of other really great material there, a lot of books, a lot of things. If you really want to know and understand liberty and why things are not going so well in our country, I think Mises.org is the best place to start out in your quest for truth. So thank you very much, Jeff, for being with me again, and we'll have to do it again sometime real soon.